What's your first impression of Taiwanese food? Dumplings or beef noodles? You can imagine there are a variety of dishes. When it comes to staple food, rice and noodles are both prominent ingredients in Taiwanese cuisine. But it was not until the mid-20th century that Taiwanese started adapting staples made of flour. In fact, in 2020, the composition of annual grains consumption was 50% of rice and 42% of wheat. In 2019, 90% of flour was imported from the US, which means a great part of the food system in Taiwan has a strong connection with the US commercialized agriculture. This video talks about student lunch in Taiwanese public schools to track the massive transformation of staple food consumption from rice to flour. I'm Lily, an undergraduate student from Taiwan, studying at UC Berkeley. This video is my research project for Geography 130. I will tell a story about the linkage between the food system and politics, especially some issues around wheat. For most Taiwanese people under 60 years old, student lunch in public schools is their shared memory. It also reflects how the government reacts to the change. This video highlights political efforts put forth by Taiwan and the US that led to an outsourcing of flour to the US and discusses how different generations of Taiwanese citizens experienced the change in staple food from the mid-20th to the early 21st century. The plan of student lunch policy originated in 1950s, but it started being promoted and applied to more schools after 1964 because of the aid from the US government. At that time, the staple food was plain buns made of flour. During this period, the US government launched many food aid programs as humanitarian assistance after World War II, including those in Japan and Taiwan. The roots of the food aid are the political interests and the problem brought by commercialized agriculture itself. First, the US had a large wheat surplus. Even though the meat industry expanded the domestic demand for wheat, and some lands have been used to grow soybeans or maize. Second, the US wanted to develop a political coalition against the Soviet Union. Public Law 480 allows the purchase of agricultural products with local currency. As the pictures show, the US officers visited Taiwan and helped the establishment of the Student Lunch Project. After the US aid ended in 1968, the United Nations provided support to Taiwan as part of the World Food Project, but it ended in 1971. What happened after the international humanitarian aid was paused? I reviewed some newspapers in the 1970s, and interestingly, the local government and public schools started launching their projects individually. It emphasizes that schools should do fundraising individually for equipment, ingredients, etc. If the projects are going well, the central government will subsidize the schools. The second piece reported that 13 public schools in Changhua County could contact 3 local flour mills for individual purchases, and the price was set to 109 New Taiwan dollars per bag. Besides, one of my family members shared his experience when he went to school in 1976. I really liked the lunch provided by my school. The meal usually consisted of steamed plain buns and rice porridge. We could enjoy rice, and plain buns smelled so good. Compared to the sweet potato porridge we had at home, the school meal was much better. Through these resources, even though flour had not been provided by international aid, flour stayed prominent in student lunch projects in the 1970s. After 1980, rice became the primary carb resource for student lunch. Since the 1980s, the surplus of rice in Taiwan has become a serious problem, so the government started encouraging the public to consume more rice. Although studies have shown that this has had little impact on the long-term trend of rice flour consumption, significant changes can be observed in the experience of student lunch for Taiwanese citizens from generation to generation. One interviewee going to the middle school in 1982 said, "I didn't have student lunch until I went to middle school, but I remember I usually had rice instead of buns." One interviewee going to school in 1992 said, "We have flour-based lunch once a week. The other 4 days, we had rice. We had many options in flour-based food: stir-fried noodles, plain buns, and buns with sweet bean paste." I collected some lunch menus released after 2000 as some examples, and it shows in December 2007, students had rice for 18 meals and no flour-based meal. In May 2010, students had rice for 18 meals while flour-based meals twice. In April 2021, students had rice for 17 meals while flour-based meals twice. Even though the trend of staple food in student lunch has changed from flour to rice, the total consumption of rice has significantly declined, while that of flour steadily increases. The trends in total grain versus student lunch consumption seem not on the same page, and they prove how the Taiwanese government adjusted the food policy to balance the excessive surplus over time. However, even though it tries to balance the consumption between rice and flour, the diet habits of the public have been changed. From rice prominent to half rice, half flour, within a half century. After we learned the long story about student lunch, there are several questions that are helpful to analyze the linkage between production in the US and consumption in Taiwan. First, what factors lead to Taiwan's outsourcing of wheat? The beginning of the outsourcing of wheat was the US aid. The main purposes were political will and expansion of the international market. Why are countries that are almost 7,000 miles away from the US trade? The development of technology and infrastructure plays a critical role. In fact, farmers working on the Midwest field before 1850 could not imagine trading with people in New York, let alone people in Asia. In the first half of the 19th century, farmers relied on local business networks to connect markets along the river. Farmers sold crops to storekeepers, and storekeepers put sacks of wheat on boats to do waterfront business. After that, some iconic transformation happened. New technologies such as elevators, railways, and telegraphs started being applied to agriculture sectors. Railways connect crop fields in Midwest, Chicago, and New York, and telegraphs reduce communication time. The invention of elevators helped crop storage, and the new larger storage tanks become something like banks. You can store your crop for a long time. A new form of crop trading was generated to a rife contract, which means people can get a piece of paper instead of a sack of grain. They can use the piece of paper to exchange for crops after a few months or a few years. Even though the political purpose is also an important factor, the adoption of technology in U.S. agriculture is more fundamental. As the pictures show, grains were loaded and ready to be shipped from Portland. The way to store, ship crops and communicate with people on other continents is fundamental to explain why the US can have excessive wheat and ship it abroad. Second, what role do the US and Taiwanese governments play in the wheat trade system? In the 1960s, the US provided crops while the Taiwanese government was in charge of resource management and distribution. Both sides launched student lunch projects to increase flour consumption. Meanwhile, some studies point out the US Department of Agriculture gave a lot of technical assistance. Experts taught the public how to make noodles, dumplings, bread, and cakes in class. Also, some TV programs taught people how to make flour-based food. The lady is Fu Pei Mei. She taught people how to cook on TV for over 40 years. In the 1960s, it was obvious that groups who held political power were leading resource distribution, and both sides put a lot of effort into expanding the demand for wheat in Taiwan. The Taiwanese government took advantage of policy making while the US government cooperated with social education. Besides, mass media played a critical role in promotion of wheat. In the 1970s, with the end of international aid, the authorities started taking responsibility for student lunch from the central government to local governments and schools. No direct evidence proves the central government was the main distributor of resources. However, through old newspapers, it's clear that the central government was the rule that offered policy guidelines and provided financial support during this period. Whereas the US government, fewer historical resources are found to prove it kept promoting flour-based food in this period. However, studies showed there had been more than 1,000 members in the Taipei Bakery Association in 1972, which means the promotion events supported by the US have substantial impact on the retail and serving sectors. Since the 1980s, when the Taiwanese government noticed a decline in local rice consumption, it has been encouraging the public to have more rice instead of flour. The prominent staple food in student lunch reflects its role in offering policy guidelines. But still, the overall rice consumption has been declining, and the government hasn't solved the relevant issues generated from the massive transition from rice to flour. Third, why is it difficult to go back to the rice prominent diet pattern? If the political regime could adjust the demand for flour in the 1960s, why didn't it succeed in the goal of increasing rice consumption after the 1980s? One common explanation accounts for the change in diet habits of Taiwanese people, but the story shows the nuance of diet habits and the structure of the international food system. Food system scholars use a framework to describe 5 sectors in the modern food chain: production, processing, distribution, retail, and service. As we learned, the whole flour system has been built in Taiwan. The supportive policies for local flour mills, promotion of flour-based food, and the most critical point, the fact that people started taking flour-based food for granted because most public school students in the 60s and 70s have experienced it. The entire chain has been well fortified from processing to service parts, except for the production. Thus, the dependency on outsourcing of wheat highlights the current food system in Taiwan. In conclusion, we learned the history of student lunch projects in Taiwan and how the US and Taiwanese governments use their political power to reorganize the food system. In 2020, Taiwan took the 7th place among the largest US wheat international consumers. After watching the video, are there any keywords coming to your mind? Local production or self-sufficiency rate? I hope this video can encourage you to think more creatively about the food systems problems that are happening around the world. Thank you for your attention.